All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this exciting discussion on global fertility decline and the challenges that follows from this trend. We're lucky today to have Darrell, CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, with us. He's the co-author of Empty Planet: The Shock of Global Population Decline. Welcome. And we have Vegard Skirbekk. Vegard works at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, Columbia University, and also here at the Norwegian Center for Aging and Health. He has written Decline and Prosper: Changing Global Birth Rate and the Advantages of Fewer Children. So the structure today is Vegard and Darrell will each do a short presentation and then have a discussion and take questions from the audience. If you in the audience have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat, and I'll read them aloud when we get to that part. So first out is Darrell. Please, the stage is yours.
Well, thanks, Erlend, and thank you, everybody, for taking the time to be on this today. And it's a particular privilege and pleasure to be with Vegard on this. I'm a great admirer of his work, and this is the first time we've actually met, so I'm really pleased to be here today. What's especially interesting about this is when we were writing Empty Planet, it came out in 2019, but we were really working on it in 2017 and 2018. People thought this idea was really eccentric, that it was not possible that what we were writing about, which was declining fertility and inevitably declining population in the world happening at a very rapid rate in comparison to what projections were at the time, that they thought it was an eccentric idea. And today, we're having a conversation about why it's happening and what the consequences are. I can assure you 5 years ago, nobody was really talking, very few people were talking about whether it was happening and what the consequences would be. They thought actually quite the opposite. So when the book came out, it was interesting to see that most of the questions that I was getting from journalists were justify how you could come to this conclusion. Today, it's okay, we accept that you're right. Now, what are the consequences of this? So I think we're appropriately moving to that next level of conversation, which is where's all of this going to go? The Empty Planet, I will say right off the top, full disclosure, is wrong. I mean, everything that we talked about in the book is happening much faster than John and I predicted. When we were writing the book, China, we said, because this was conventional wisdom at the time, the population was going to peak in the mid-2030s and kind of gradually decline at the time. Remember the UN projections on China, their birth rate they had at 1.5. And it was going to rise through the course of the century to 1.8. And we all know, anybody who's been following this, that China's even announced at this point that they're probably closer to 1. So way off on that kind of thing. And then every other place that we were looking at what was going on, we were more optimistic about what the situation was going to be than has proven to be the case. So this is rapidly becoming an issue, I think, that people are starting to more appreciate than certainly when we were writing back in 2015. I'm happy to discuss why this is happening. In fact, Vegard and Erlend and I had quite a conversation going before you guys got here on all of this, and but we can save that for the discussion. But honestly, in terms of debate, I don't think that there's a lot of debate, maybe on some of the details, but the general trends, I think that there's general agreement. I went through Vegard's book again today and yesterday, and I have to say it's a really fine piece of writing. And if you want to read something that gives a very wide-ranging perspective with great data and great insight, I'd really recommend to everybody on this call that you pick up a copy, because I certainly got an awful lot out of it. But then again, I'm hard-pressed to think of very much that I disagree with that's in the book. In fact, I've learned a fair amount reading it. But what I'd really like to suggest right now is that we're actually, just like we were 5 years ago, moving into a new type of discussion on fertility and population. At that time, when we wrote Empty Planet, we're also at the early stages of another thing that's going to be emerging, and that's the politics of this issue. And the reason that I say that is because you can see it's starting to form. You can see the political groups starting to form around this. And I would argue, just like we did in Empty Planet, that this is the biggest issue that nobody's or very few people are talking about when that book came out, that is going to dominate what's going to happen as we go through this century to the human species. This issue is also going to dominate our political discussion at an increasing level. And why is that? Because people are waking up to what's actually going on. I would say that where we are in this conversation is where climate change was probably 2 decades ago. It's still a fairly scientific discussion. It's still a fairly academic discussion. It's still a fairly specialist discussion, but you're starting to see it emerge in our political discussion more and more. And there's really 3 groups that are dominating or starting to grow out of this. Not dominating yet. They're starting to grow out of this conversation. The first one is the degrowth movement, in which their view is that the smaller the population, the better. Human beings, everything that they've done basically to the face of the earth has been probably negative, and that we have to get smaller and be doing a lot less, particularly in terms of consumption. Now, ironically, they may be right about the point of declining consumption, but not for the reasons that they give. Whenever I'm confronted by this conversation at public events, and I ask them, okay, well, what's the ideal number? Usually, what I hear back is something like 2 billion, and that's sort of a population around the Second World War. And it's like, well, the next 2 billion is not going to look like that 2 billion. The population pyramid is going to be flipped. A lot fewer kids and a lot more older people. Is that really what you're talking about? Because that's a very difficult society to manage. So there's more thinking that has to go on the degrowth side, but it's there. Then there's the liberal technocratic approach to this, which really regards this issue and people deciding that they don't want to have kids as a technocratic issue. That if we just have the right solutions to market failure, principally some sort of career compensation for women who decide to be mothers, and also if how much we can lower the cost of having kids, that would be another solution. So it's a solution to inequality. So they're both forms of market failure. If we can deal with those 2 issues, then people will start having more kids. But places like where you're sitting today have probably done more than anybody in the world in terms of dealing with this. And all of the Nordic countries, for example, continue to have declining fertility. So I think we're going to struggle with those options. They're probably, actually, most of them are good for people who decide they want to have kids. We have to make it possible for them to achieve what they want on that front. But the market incentives really aren't the big thing. It's a cultural issue that we're dealing with here. And then finally, the group that is probably the most troubling in all of this is what I call the neonatalists. And they are a combination of people who are traditionalists, religious traditionalists, and they have a traditional view of the family. Their view is if we could just take everything back to the way it was around the time of the baby boom, everything would be wonderful and we'd have another baby boom. I don't know that we necessarily want to live in that world, particularly women. The second group is the technology group. And the most prominent person in public discourse today on the issue of declining fertility is Elon Musk. And he's very representative of this. But his issue isn't this about family values or anything of that nature. His issue is about whether or not human beings can stay on top of technology that's rapidly evolving. This is why he's been so negative, for example, about artificial intelligence. So there's this tech element. It's almost like an Ayn Rand objectivist type of perspective on the place of human beings in the world. And so that's getting some play in this neonatalist movement. And then there's a third, and it's the one that we're seeing most clearly these days, and it's the nativist element. It's not just a matter of how many, it's a matter of who. So if we have to have immigration to offset declining fertility and declining population, I'm very worried about the effect that that's going to have on my culture. So these groups are kind of converging in the neonatalist front, and we're going to be hearing more and more about them as this issue becomes more prominent. Remember, by 2030, everybody in the world who was born during what the West calls the baby boom is going to be at retirement age. They're going to be 65. Maybe we'll extend retirement age a little bit. Maybe we'll go up to 70, but we'll be an older population by the time we get to 2030. And then by 2040, 2050, a lot of those people are going to be leaving this mortal coil. So we're in a very interesting position when it comes to global population. I think the politics, though, are going to be different. I think they're going to be difficult. And I think that we're at the start of another conversation that's going to happen around what we want the nature and the shape of humanity to be. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Back to you, Erlend.
So first of all, thanks so much to Darrell for joining in. I'm very honored and happy that you took time to present your views and also discuss the book and the topic, which I think deserves much more attention. And thank you also to Erlend for organizing this. All right, so basically the big issue I put in the title is I think global fertility reductions are likely inevitable, and we probably need to find ways to adapt better. And can we do this? Can we decline and prosper? I think it's a bit important to go a bit, not just a bit back in time, but a couple of centuries back in time, and to understand what has really happened over many years. And what is commonly discussed is that we see fertility, gross fertility shown by the green line, has declined from, say, 4 or 5 children in Western countries, 7, 8 in most non-Western countries, to levels now below replacement fertility, often around 1.5, 1.6 or so. And what is often forgotten is that if you look at the number of surviving children, around 1800, you had high fertility, but you had also a majority of the children not surviving to adulthood. Most kids born did not reproduce themselves. So you might end up with only around 2 or slightly above 2 surviving children. And only at the period when fertility was actually declining, you had a situation where the number of children surviving were increasing. And what the situation you see now is in terms of surviving children, it's much less dramatic, possibly, than what you would think of if you only consider the green line gross fertility, because you went from a situation with around 2 surviving children to a situation with, say, 1.5, 1.6 children today in many countries, and that implies a reduction of 25%. Not that fertility is perhaps just a half or even less of what it used to be. So here's some data from different countries. For example, from Italy, they had a situation like this. You had population growth, but you had around 2 surviving children, 5 children born, a little bit less than half surviving to reproduce themselves. And only in recent years, you've seen fertility drop below replacement levels and stay at this very low levels. Same goes for Sweden, where you had increases from 2 surviving children to 3 or so, and then declines. Germany, France, you had an even less. So France has very high fertility today. Historically, even going back to 1801, it has had only around 2 surviving children. Only in the mid 20th century, you saw slightly higher number of surviving children with 2.5 to 3 children, causing population growth. And why are we having so few children today? Well, there's so many things to do, basically. The world is a bit different, and especially in terms of childbearing, you have many have a wish to complete more and more education than they used to do. They want to be as educated as others for social reasons, for economic reasons, for self-interest. They would like to have a secure job before having children. Most would still like to have a stable partnership, in most cases marriage. People would like to save a bit, to have a bit of capital, and commonly people would like to buy a house before starting childbearing. Moreover, more and more people are spending a year or so traveling. They might play the dating field for extended periods of time. They might also seek the perfect partner. People might be more picky about partners than they used to be. And people often commonly, this is also not to be forgotten, that this is a fairly recent phenomenon in Western country, that people test out their partners before having children with extended cohabitation periods, which also results in postponed and delayed fertility. These forces are not likely to disappear. Moreover, pronatal policies, as Darrell was mentioning earlier, are commonly ineffective. Policies to raise fertility, or at least with the potential to increase childbearing, such as more generous transfers to families or more parental leave support or more flexible ways of combining child raising and careers are often found to be ineffective in terms of raising fertility. That is, they might be effective in terms of increasing economic equality, for example. There might be many other good reasons for introducing these policies, but typically these policies are found to have very modest or very often no effects. Moreover, these effects are commonly found to be only temporary and disappear after a limited period of time. And I think this is very important. We have many more selection criteria than we used to have when we try to find a partner. So this is one example on grip strength, that for women, grip strength doesn't have any relationship to marriage, but for men, there didn't used to be any relationship with physical grip strength and with how likely you were to marry. But in later born cohorts, we found that men with low physical grip strength are more likely to remain single. And this is a new phenomenon. And we also found similar developments in other individual traits, which might be difficult to change, such as personality. You find that for women, being neurotic, which is a common personality trait, is not related to childbearing. For men, it is, but it's only for later born cohorts, only for men born in recent periods, suggesting that men who score high on neuroticism are less likely to find a stable partnership and form a family. Another possibly important issue, this is, I believe it's stated from Ipsos, this is in Norwegian, this is the tro på Gud, means the portion believing in God, and it's decreased from 52 to 26% from the mid-1980s to 2022. And the proportion stating no increased from 20.7 to 51.3%. So secularization is taking place. This is some data globally. We do know that there's a strong relationship between religious affiliation. So the unaffiliated, which is a large group, have very fairly low fertility, 1.7. Buddhists have also fairly low fertility, 1.6 globally. Christians have much higher, 2.7. Muslims slightly higher again, 3.1. And we also find that these dimensions still hold, even if you control for socioeconomic variables such as educational length. So religion matters. And even in fairly secular countries such as Norway, with generous family support, we find that if you look at, for example, the female graph, you find that the number of children is quite stable over time among those who married in the state church, while it's much, much lower among those who married in the city hall. These are among people who did partner. Of course, many people are single and would have lower fertility still. But there's been a phenomenal shift over time in the proportion marrying in the having a civil marriage versus having a religious marriage, which can contribute to explaining the decline in childbearing outcomes. Moreover, there are many new factors affecting whether what people think they should have children or not. The young often state in surveys that they might fear the world the children they could have would live in, including fears of conflict, climate risks, resource scarcities, how the children would contribute to these, or it's subject to the negative consequences of this, and also pollution and job availability. And many of these fears are fairly new, and they might negatively affect fertility preferences. And one survey suggests that 4 in 10 young people fear having children due to the climate crisis. So this is the theory developed 20 years ago, which has actually been referred to much more in recent years. And it's termed the low fertility trap, and it argues that once fertility falls below a certain level, say Norway just had fertility fall below 1.5, it might be less likely to recover. And there are 3 key reasons for this, one being purely demographic. If you have fewer daughters, there's less women of reproductive age in the next generation, and this will decrease fertility, decrease number of births. If you grow up with smaller families, if you have fewer siblings, this will affect how your social preferences for family size, that smaller siblings influence your own family ideals and how many children you expect to have on your own. Moreover, many people wait to have children until they have achieve the same living standards as their parents. And if they, due to, for example, rising housing prices or declining, what they perceive to be declining material standards, they might postpone fertility for a long period of time, and this might imply declines and postponement of fertility. And these mechanisms can be self-reinforcing. Fewer younger persons might have less political power. If you have fewer siblings, that will result in each generation having lower fertility ideals. And certainly if you have fewer women girls born, that will result in fewer women in reproductive age in the coming years. And these factors can be important to explain why, for example, Norway has seen not only a decline in fertility, but a massive postponement of fertility. Where if you go back not that many years, you used to have peak fertility in the 90s, in the late mid-20s. And now fertility has basically become a phenomenon of for those, primarily for those in their 30s, where the mid-early 30s are the peak ages of childbearing. And this is something that has happened in many countries. Childbearing has been postponed. And this is the share of live births to mothers aged 35 plus in Norway, which has increased from below 14% to more than 22% from 1999 to 2019. And this phenomenon of declining fertility is not equally distributed among women and men. Childlessness is increasing much more among men than among women. And among those born in the, if you go back to the mid-1940s, people born in the mid-1940s, you found that by the time they were 40 years old in the mid-1980s, only 15% or so among the men and less than 10% of the women were childless. But for both women and men, it has increased over time. And in 1979, those born 1979, 70% of the women, but more than 31% of the men have seen are now childless at the age of 40. And this much more rapid increase among men has not yet been echoed in sufficiently more focus on why men are not having children. Well, still the majority of research on childbearing being on much more on women than on men. And this is something that one should probably focus more on in the years to come, because the implications of, for example, being childless can be at least as strong for men as for women, including in terms of elevated mortality. So one key reason, which is also increasing for every subsequent cohort, is the longer it takes to finish education. Average years of schooling have increased consistently for a very long period of time. And just to stay at the same level as your peers, one needs more and more schooling to stay at the same level. And this is also important because many people choose friends, partners, social milieus from their college peers. And not having education is something that can be seen as very negative for many people. And education levels are increasing in all world regions in recent years. But in spite of the fact that we have children later and later, there's not been any increase in tolerance of what is a preferred age for first birth or last birth. If you ask people of both women and men, different ages, you find that people prefer to have the first birth. Women should not have it before they are 26, 27, men before they were 29, 28. But also they should not have the last birth for at ages much above 40 for men and much above 37, 38 for women. This is not reflected in ideals to remain childless. Again, I give Norway as an example, and we find that the intention to remain childless is very low among the women who have low education, medium, and high education. But the risk of childlessness is much higher than the intention. And this is something we find for all countries where we study this. Childlessness is typically not intentional. It's something people end up being, not something they stated they would like to.
Closing in on time now, Vegard.
All right. I'll try to. And I would a couple of points. Modern dating might be ineffective. One survey found that there's only 1 in 562 chances of actually finding a person with the desired characteristics on a given day in the UK, and women are more pickier than men. I think I'll go quite quick with some of these graphs. Housing prices have increased tremendously, more than tripled since the 1990s in Norway in real prices. Low fertility is likely here to stay, and we need to adapt. I also would like to stress that that aging is global and inevitable. No, it's something we can't really escape. This is a quote from the UN, and childbearing encouragements are unlikely to be very effective in terms of raising fertility, and no plausible assumption about international migration would more than have a moderate impact on population aging in the years to come. We introduced a new measure where we don't look at people as old as from the age of 65, but we define people as old when they have a given illness level rather. And when somebody has the same health level as a global 65-year-old, and we found that this varies tremendously. People in Japan, Switzerland are much healthier than the global average, and they tend to be in the mid-70s when they have the same age as somebody, say, in Papua New Guinea in their 40s. Suggesting that people are much, they might be chronologically older, but they might be, in terms of health, younger, even if they have a higher age. And if you adjust for this and look at and compare the old age dependency ratio, which is what's commonly used, Japan has a very old population with a very high old age dependency ratio. If you account for the fact that Japanese grow sick at very old ages, you find that Japan is actually younger than, for example, India, where you have a very early onset of poor health. So the world might look very different if you account for health. Technology is important. We might, if you implement current technologies, you might only need 60 million people in global food production to feed everyone in the world. Currently, there's around 800 million people working in food production. We probably need less people in the future than we have today. And I think this is important. As Darrell was mentioning initially, there's also India has seen below replacement fertility, and this has implied that all the world's 10 largest economies now have below replacement, and some have had below replacement for more than half a century. And if you look at what is produced in the world, if you go back to 1970, you found that almost everything produced in the world is in countries with above replacement fertility. And today, this is no longer the case. The blue bar shows the proportion of everything produced in the world in terms of from countries with below replacement fertility. And in fact, in spite of the fact that fertility has been low for a very long time for many of these countries, global production is now completely dominated by low fertility countries. And finally, it's important to invest in skills, and education levels have increased worldwide. Illiteracy has rapidly declined. But if you go a little bit beyond that, so this is a new study from Sarah Gust and colleague, and they find that if you look at the proportion who are not performing at the lowest PISA level among 15-year-olds, which probably will say a lot about how countries will age in the future, they find that in much of Latin America, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Northern Africa, you find very large proportions, majorities performing below the lowest level of the PISA score, which suggests that one should invest much more in quality of education. So this is a very basic level, and it suggests that countries have probably failed in terms of investing in quality education, and rather try to give everyone a very, very basic level, which is probably inadequate to deal with, to basically meet the expectations of modern labor markets. So that's my final slide. So a bit of advertisement. This is the book I was writing on Turn, Decline, and Prosper, and I tried to elaborate on some of these arguments further in the book. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vegard. Darrell, I understand that you reached out to Vegard after reading his book. What do you think about this approach, this a little bit more positive, hopeful approach?
Well, yeah, I did. In fact, the first contact between Vegard and me was me having read his book and trying to find him, and then sending him a note saying how much I enjoyed his book. And I think it's a really solid piece of work. But give people a little bit of there's supposed to be some disagreement here, so I'll have some disagreement. The reason that I'm a little more concerned about the future structure of the population is really twofold. One, I think that the economic arguments really are disproportionately focused on the easiest situations to solve, which are production related. And the truth is, exactly as Vegard, and this is where I do agree with him, exactly as he said, I mean, we've made a lot of progress in terms of technological adaptation, and we'll be making more of it. I mean, I even look at my business and the effect that artificial intelligence has had over the space of the last year and a half. 2 years ago, I didn't even know what large language models were, or what ChatGPT was, and I use it all every day now. Like I use PowerPoint or I use Excel. So there are going to be improvements in terms of production, but that's the low-hanging fruit of the economy. The real issue that we're going to be dealing with in terms of the population is consumption. There's a very good paper written by Charles Jones at Stanford on this topic, and he wrote it. I learned about it because I read an editorial, or I read an op-ed in the New York Times in which they were talking about the empty planet result, and it was like, is this guy writing about an empty planet? And I looked at it and read it, and it was obvious that he had. And so I went and looked up the article, and his point, which had an effect on what I was thinking, was that our issue is not production, it's consumption. And if our economy is driven by consumption, and particularly since the end of the Second World War, and even going back to the Industrial Revolution, that's what it's been driven by. Economic growth has been driven by that. If you reduce the number of consumers, and particularly when you shift the weight of consumption to the older cohorts instead of the younger cohorts starting families, buying cars, doing all the things that you do at the start of your life, and the weight of the consumption moves to the older cohorts, where basically they don't consume like they did when they were younger, we're going to have a consumption problem. And a robot doesn't solve that, because a robot doesn't buy a car. I mean, a robot doesn't buy a dress. A robot doesn't raise kids. A robot doesn't do any of those things. Technology doesn't do any of those things. It makes it easier to create the things that people will consume, but it doesn't create consumers. So we're going to have a very difficult time when it comes to economic growth going into the future. And the degrowth people, as I said before, there's a lot that you can argue with, but maybe on this point, they actually have a point. And it's not because it's desirable, it's because it's inevitable, what we're going to go through. So I don't know how all of that works out between production and consumption, but I don't think it's going to be as easy as introducing technology into production, or keeping seniors in the workplace for longer so they can continue to add production and experience and all the rest of it to the part of the economy that creates things. It's going to be the other side of it that's going to be a problem. And this is what Jones argues in his article. Is basically says, if we reduce the number of consumers, then you reduce the amount of consumption and you reduce the level of growth, and we're going to have to prepare for a future that looks like that. So if I have a small, very small, like a millimeter disagreement with Vegard, it's maybe on that point rather than on very many other things.
Yeah, Vegard, care to address the point of consumption?
Well, I can't. I think we don't really know yet, because it's so thank you. It's a very valid point. I think it's a major concern. And I should also say, nobody has ever gone through what we're going through now globally with the below replacement fertility and rapidly aging economies. So I think we will have to see and learn from the best performers. And that's what I've been devoting much of my research to, basically. So we already see that some countries have managed much better in terms of investing in health, for example, with the aging differing by more than 30 years between countries. We have found also internally within countries, there's massive differences across, say Norwegian counties or states in North America. And I think in terms of consumption, I think we don't really know quite either how we best can deal with it. We might have how will global consumption be follow from population stabilization decline? I think on the one hand, we will see an increased consumption from the parts of the world that are still rising, because of course you have a lot of demographic momentum. India might have reached replacement, but since the cohorts are so young, it will take many decades before we see the populations decline. And I also think we should try to understand how, for example, countries such as the oldest country on the planet is Japan. How they have certainly problems with their economy, but they also adapted. They have also plateaued at a very high level with high levels of consumption, high levels of well-being, a well-functioning society. How can we learn from them? And I don't have the full answers because we're not there yet, but I think this is something we probably can study to a much greater extent, because we do have some economies which have at least partially gone in this direction. And I'm not sure how the best policy response, and that's something we should probably focus more on trying to figure out in the years to come.
Yes, we were talking before we started here a little bit about what should the policies be that governments should enact. Would one of you, and also if any in the audience have questions, please ask them in the chat. But could you please talk a little bit about what policymakers should do here? Darrell?
So I think that people who are on this call took the time on a Monday to come out to this probably know pretty much what governments can do. And they're generally related to the market failure issues that I talked about earlier, which is trying to find a way to make it more possible for women to have, and Vegard pointed out, there is a significant gap between desired level of fertility and actual fertility. I mean, we see this in survey and after survey. So to be able to reduce that gap by making sure that the penalties for the motherhood penalty for women in the workplace is somehow ameliorated, and then on the other side, for looking at children and raising children as more of a public good rather than a private responsibility, and doing what we can to make it easier for parents to do that. But what I would say is that I would say it's an optimistic perspective on what it is that can be done by governments in order to deal with this situation. And most importantly, I think it's a misunderstanding of why it's actually happening. And Empty Planet was basically about two issues. One, that this is a story about female emancipation, and it's an incredibly positive story and something that we should be celebrating. But secondly, what we're dealing with here is a cultural phenomena, not a market phenomena. And the problem that we have on the cultural front is we don't have a pro-natalist type of culture, in the sense that people really celebrate having kids the way that they used to. I mean, the argument about the reasons that people say that they have, and I do these surveys all the time, so I've seen them. Pew's done some great surveys on this. I've seen them in other places too. Why don't you have kids? And the ones about climate change and bringing kids into a difficult world and all the rest of it, to me, these sound more like ex post facto justifications for why people didn't end up having kids, as opposed to the real reasons. And for some people, they actually are legitimate, and that's what they've chosen to do. But a large part, it really comes down to what people say in surveys, and I take them at their word. The single biggest reason is they just don't want to have kids. It's the single biggest reason on surveys. I just don't want to have kids. And then the second biggest reason is I can't. So they've waited, as Vegard showed on his charts, they've waited so long before they've started their building of their families that it becomes incredibly difficult just from a biological perspective, because we only make kids the way that we've always made them. And as a result, we're stuck in this thing where we've got a whole group of people who say I'm opting out of this, and then you've got another group of people who say I'd like to opt in, but biologically, relationship wise, other things, it just is not it's not possible for me anymore. And then the third reason you get to, and this is the one that everybody focuses on, is the market failure reasons, which are, it'll hurt my career, or kids are too expensive, or I can't find the right house, or whatever. Now, none of this is to say, by the way, that I disagree with the market failure point of view. I actually think that there's a lot of opportunity there, that if we get some family policies correct, if we are able to reduce the motherhood penalty, if we are able to make children more of a public good rather than a private preoccupation, and putting all of that weight on parents, then maybe we're going to see some improvement in these things. But if you're expecting a turnaround back up to replacement level for Canada, for example, where we've dropped into that, we're definitely in the low fertility trap. Our latest fertility rate is 1.33. So Vegard, you know what that means. I mean, we're firmly in the low fertility trap. That we can spend a lot of money to try and get back up, but it probably won't be the case. And, in fact, the government, interestingly enough, a couple of years ago brought in a much more aggressive policy of financial incentive in terms of childcare for families. So reduce the cost of childcare, they argue, by 50%. And during that time, they've dropped fertility from 1.5 to 1.33. So, I mean, the correlation just doesn't add up. Now, there might be a lag effect here. We'll have to see, how it builds up over time. But do I think Canada will get back to 1.2 or 2.1? Very difficult to see how that happens.
Okay.
Yeah, no, these are very good points. I would also like to stress that I certainly believe this is primarily a culture phenomenon, but also one not only driven by policies and institutional factors, but also one driven by, and please not forget this, much better contraceptives. We have far fewer unplanned births than we used to. We have long-lasting hormonal contraceptives, which are in some cases almost fail-proof compared to what the kind of contraceptives that used to be available. So that has changed the whole reproductive setting in terms of reducing the number of at least unplanned births, which could be positive. We always talk about female and emancipation. I think that's important, but it's also important that this is historically people had more children than they would like to have. In many cases, more children that they were able to have, and this is also a story about men, that male fertility preferences were also not realized. They had more children than they would like to have, but then in modern times it completely reversed, and much more for men. So men have gone to an extreme where they are to much less of the degree that women are able to realize their fertility intentions. So I think focusing on the gender dimension is very important, and also trying to understand how for example, how men can have, with robotization, automation, technological change, many typically male jobs are really disappearing in not only primary sectors, in agriculture, mining, and so forth, but also in terms of and industries, but also in terms of now maybe more mid-level, typically male jobs. And this, we know from the literature, can be possibly more important for fertility outcomes also among women than the situation for women, where you have other effects, but childbearing consequence of poor economic prospects might be very different for the two genders. And I think it's important to also to consider how possibly can men try to increasingly adapt to what is available in the labor market, with more focusing more on the kind of jobs that are available, for example in healthcare, in terms of or maybe increasing the status of women for male jobs, in terms of, for example, typical crafts professions, such as the case is in some countries where they have a fairly high status, and in many other countries having skilled manual labor has a very low status and may make it difficult on the partner markets. Also, a certain cultural change might be possible in terms of acknowledging and adapting to the kind of demands in the labor market to allow more men to have jobs that make it easier to form families, basically.
Are there any countries that we could look to as examples, or anybody doing it right these days?
I think many well, sorry, Darrell.
No. Actually, I would struggle to find it. Normally, what I say, and because most of my activity doesn't take place in the Nordics, I would say the Nordics have done more than just about anybody in the world on this, and they're all struggling with the same problem. And the issue is, or problem. I don't want to say it's a problem. It's the same reality. It's a difference between a problem and a reality. The same reality as everybody else is. And there are some countries, as Vegard correctly stated, that are further down this road than other countries. But we're all kind of headed in the same direction. Even Africa, we look at Africa. If you look at the population pyramid of Nigeria, for example, it looks like a rocket ship. It's like tons and tons of kids at the bottom, and then it just goes like this. It's like almost like a needle, compared to the Italian population pyramid, which looks like an inverted pyramid. Right? It looks like this. Very different situations. But the problems that Africa has, whenever people say, "Oh, they've got lots and lots of people," but the problem that they have is they don't have the social institutions to take advantage of it. They don't have the economic institutions to take advantage of it. There's, in fact, the surfeit, or actually the excess number of young men, makes me very worried about violence in the region, to be honest, because there's a high degree of correlation between a lot of young men and the potential for violence in certain places. So I don't look at Africa necessarily as a panacea, but there are places in this world that have tried to struggle with this issue, and they're struggling against a global phenomena of cultural change that's taking place everywhere from downtown Delhi to downtown Dallas. To downtown Copenhagen. It's a cultural phenomenon that's swept the world, and we just have a very different way that we look at reproduction in families than the way that our grandparents looked at it or their parents looked at it. And as a result of that, that's what we're pushing against. And people continue to see, and particularly in governments and academics, I would say, continue to see this as an issue of market failure, because that's the situation we would like to see, because we understand how to deal with that one. It's all about the right incentives. So we want to see the problem that way, or the issue. I keep calling it a problem, and I don't mean to. See the issues in that context, because we understand that. We understand the governing instruments. We understand how things are supposed to work. So we assume that if we apply our logic to it, that it will change things. But if you're up against something that's cultural, that's very uncomfortable. We like to understand these things as more economic than as cultural, but cultural is a difficult set of issues to deal with. It's like trying to understand nativism in politics, the rise of the radical right and nativism. Everybody wants to interpret it as an economic problem, or too many people want to interpret it as an economic problem. It's about, people who've been left behind by offshoring of manufacturing. I mean, this was the dominant position, even in J.D. Vance's book on hillbilly elegy in the United States after Trump was elected. And a lot of the intellectual discussion went into people who have been marginalized by the modern economy. And it's like, well, actually, no. A better explanation for what was happening in terms of the rise of the radical right was nativism. There was a high degree of correlation between rejection of immigration and cultural change and voting for Trump, as opposed to poor lower middle class white men who've been left out of the economy overwhelmingly voting for Trump. Actually, the degree of correlation between voting for Trump and economic and affluence wasn't really that strong. So, I mean, I think to bring this back to our question, we really have to focus on what's going on as opposed to what we want to be going on, because we understand how to deal with that problem. We have to confront problem. We have to confront the issue as it is rather than as the issue we want it to be.
So we have a question from the audience here. Demographers commonly reject the alarmist narratives surrounding this issue. I come from Argentina, where total births have declined by 32% over the past 7 years, but where the issue is entirely absent from the policy sphere and completely unacknowledged by the government. Is it possible that in some settings we might need a greater sense of urgency? Vegard?
I think So my stance is that women and men should be allowed, or should be the government should do its best to try to help them to achieve the number of children they would like to have or not like to have. And so for Argentina and or many other countries, the situation one should first consider how is actually the fertility preferences looking like. Do people actually want fewer children than they used to? And if so, well, the government should probably do less. But if this is against fertility preferences, yes, then one certainly should try to consider policies, implement interventions that might help women and men achieve the number of children they do want. So it depends, is my answer.
Yeah, I would say the new president of Argentina is actually arguing about families now. It was part of what he was talking about. So this is what I'm talking about. He is somebody I would say, if you really probe specifically on this issue, would be more of the pronatalist type of approach. The difference with the pronatalists is not that they believe that things should be done for people to have the number of children that they want. That's table stakes. Their real position is we should change perceptions on the number of children that we want. That's the difference. So it's not just dealing with the market failure issue, it's changing the market.
There's a commentary also about isn't the issue about consumption versus production the old question of whether supply creates its own demand?
So Darrell, you go ahead.
No, well, no. It's supply. It will create its. Well, that's the Steve Jobs argument. You don't need an iPad until you know you need it, right? I mean, the problem that we've got is we've got a life stage problem in the economy. Eventually, what we're going to have is a size problem when it's going to be the decline of the population, and I would argue that the population is going to peak somewhere in the 2040s. And I was wrong on Empty Planet, so maybe I'm wrong about this too. Somewhere in the 2040s, it's never going to get to 9 billion. We're not going to celebrate like the UN did last year, the 9 billionth person. It's not going to happen. We're going to stop somewhere between 8 and 9, probably. Let's pick a midpoint, and then we're going to start to see the decline. The issue is not just the size, it's the construction of the population. So when you have a lot more older people in the population that require a lot more government services like pensions, healthcare, dealing with issues that are a different form of consumption. They're more of a service-based consumption. Yes, you can convert some of your economy towards that, but that's not economic growth. That's just moving from one place to another place. What we're going to really confront is things that relate to the goods and services that we bought as a younger world, not being as appealing as they used to be. I'll give you a quick story about this. I was at a conference in Banff, Alberta. And the only reason I raised Banff, Alberta is because it challenges some of the beautiful places that you have in Norway as some of the most beautiful places on earth. If you've never been to the Rocky Mountains and to see what that's like, it's really something to see. But it was one of the presentations I saw was on the future of sports entertainment. And it was all about trying to find ways of reducing the amount of attention that people had to spend on watching sporting events and creating more like small snippets to attract young people where they could, express preferences through technology or maybe even gamble, because ultimately that was what really it seemed to be about. And I was sitting there going, yeah, there aren't as many of them as you think, and they've got no money. Why are, the biggest minds in sports and entertainment, you're thinking about that. What about their parents and their grandparents? Because what they have on their hands are time and money. What are you making for them? And the answer is, who? I don't know who you're talking about, because they're invisible. The most invisible, most important market segment of the future is women over the age of 60. They have a lot of money. More than we think. Our image of women, particularly in the developed world, of how women who are older, how they live their lives, they're an incredibly happy group for the most part. They tend to be very society. They're the exact opposite of older men, by the way. Older men are a real problem because they tend not to be as attached to their communities. They tend not to be happy, particularly single older men, high risk of suicide. high risk of all sorts of things that are related to health issues. But this group of older women, when was the last time you saw a woman who was 70 in an ad treated as a mainstream consumer? The answer was never, at least where I live. But that's where the economy has to go. But our marketers, and particularly not our manufacturers, but our marketers, who are supposed to be the thin edge of the wedge of making this connection, have no concept of it at all. Not even thinking about it. I mean, occasionally you'll see L'Oreal puts out an ad for older women in beauty products, but very occasionally. Or maybe Nestle will do something, but completely ignores it. So our economy is going to have to shift in that direction, and almost nobody is thinking about it. In our pre-conversation, Vegard and I were basically nodding our heads like he is now, saying, "Yeah, this is interesting," but it's not a high growth opportunity; it's a compensation.
Well, it could be high growth. I think we should also note that peak earnings historically used to be in the 30s. People used to earn the maximum earnings across the lifetime when they were around 30 years old. Now peak earnings is 20, 30 years later. And we should probably try to deal with that. This is, as Darrell,
that's a good point. I like that.
Yep. It's a great market opportunity. And markets have just been slow to adapt, possibly.
Yeah, so and I deal with them every day. And when I walk in and talk about what we're talking about today, it's like somebody came in and spoke to them in Martian. I mean, it's just like no, we're not thinking about this. Instead, what we want to have is a new app that the 15-year-olds can use to spend the money that they don't have to participate in something that we're going to produce for them, because that's the future. And it's like, yeah, in 1950, it really was. It's not the future anymore. So, the thing about grandparents in sports, they have the culture of watching it. They have the time to watch it. And you've not created anything for them to participate in. You're focused on their grandkids, and the grandkids there isn't as many as you think. And they just don't have the wealth to be able to participate at the level you need them to. So we need to find a way to extract the wealth from the older people, which is, I agree 100% with Vegard. We have to shift our thinking, but it's not happening. Not yet.
Did you guys read The Spirit Level, the book from 2009 by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett? It's about, the subtitle is why equality is better for everyone. And it talks about how the inequality makes societies worse. Do you think maybe that relates to this problem as well?
Rising inequality. I think it certainly is a key issue here that you have aging economies which are richer than they've ever been, and you do need you need to address the global issue of inequality for sure in a fertility and age perspective. I certainly think that's something that should be addressed much more in policies, yes, for sure.
The interesting thing on fertility, and it's well documented in Vegard's book, is that a correlation between wealth and fertility used to be positive, and it's now turned to more negative. If you want to find high fertility places, look for places that are in desperate situations, have a lot of patriarchy, very high levels of religion, and a lot of poverty.
Yeah, that's mainly how women has it in those societies, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
That could be connected to how women have it in those societies or those segments.
Yeah. But a really important element that Vegard pointed to is the male aspect of this, which almost nobody's looked at. If you look at the state of men and women in the world today, particularly in developed countries, women are doing much better than men. I mean, they're more likely to graduate from primary school. They're more likely to graduate from university. They're very strong in a lot of the professions, medical profession, all sorts of professions you want to look at. And there's always more boys born than men, or boys born than girls in every society, except when there's artificial intervention. But by the age of 40, the difference has almost disappeared. And by the time you get to the 100, and by the way, more and more people are living to the age of 100, the ratio is 5 to 1. And the reason for that is, of the 20 reasons that the World Health Organization tracks for people dying prematurely, 16 of them are more frequent among men, mostly for stupid things. Road accidents, suicide, not following their doctor's orders, all of the lifestyle-related diseases that you can die from prematurely, much more frequent among men. Men are struggling, but it's not a popular thing to say, but men are struggling.
That's great.
I think we'll let that be the last word. Thank you very much for coming, both Darrell and Vegard.
Well, thank you so much, Darrell and Erlend.
Well, thanks, Vegard. It was great fun meeting you.
Thank you.
Likewise.